Hello, everyone. I hope you had an opportunity to attend the Stockholm Water Prize ceremony earlier today, and also many other events throughout the week. 2 more days to go, so let's hang in there and really squeeze the most out of World Water Weeks. Welcome to this high-level panel. Welcome everyone, speakers at home and on site. I hope really that the conference is going well for all of you. I would like to take this opportunity to thank the Swedish International Development Agency, SIDA, for supporting SIWI as an organization, and not least today's high-level panel on innovative approaches to support peace and conflict prevention. This high-level panel is really a follow-up to the UN Water Conference that took place in March earlier this year in New York, and the official side event that took place, which was entitled Commitment to Accelerate Cooperation on Water, Environment, Climate, and Peace. That side event was co-hosted by the government of Sweden and the Federal Republic of Somalia. And it was co-organized by SIWI and also CIPRI as part of the Stockholm Hub on Environment, Climate and Security. And I am really pleased to see that we have a representative from the Somali government able to join us here in person today, so very warmly welcome. You have probably heard me say this a couple of times this week here on stage, but with the pressing issues around climate change and the speed at which climate change is happening, environmental degradation, we're witnessing that every day, but also increased pressures on water, be it too little water, too much water, or too dirty water. The international community can no longer stay inert. Already 4 billion people around the world today live in water scarcity for at least 1 month per year. 4 billion people. Around the world, water resources are too often being overused and with an unsustainable way of management. The long-term sustainability of the water resources is at risk. By 2025, more or less tomorrow, 50% of the world's population will be living in water-scarce regions. Many will be forced to migrate because of water scarcity. And this, of course, can lead to competition over scarce water resources. It can lead to tension and potentially conflict. But I'm an optimist, and based also on history, we know, and at SIWI, we choose to focus on that, we also see that transboundary water management has often led to cooperation rather than conflict. And even though the environment is very much under stress, more than ever, these extreme weather events, these prolonged droughts, the failed crops, the unprecedented floods, forest fires, all of that we see can lead to, unfortunately, a tendency towards rather increased tensions. And that is what today's panel is also very much going to look into. So in the face of such challenges, managing these shared natural resources, water being one of them, in a cooperative and collaborative way is vital. especially in fragile or conflict-affected settings. Cooperation over shared natural resources can take many forms and shapes. And there is no one-size-fits-all on this. It all needs to be, of course, adapted to the context in which it happens. For example, transboundary water agreements can be an important mechanism for sustaining peace and addressing disputes. But there are many transboundary waters that are not covered by such agreements and legal documents. Other basins that have agreements are not really prepared for the future climate impacts over the next 20 or 50 years. So these agreements might no longer be valid and functional as such. So we need to look at that. Transboundary cooperation and governance of water is still unfortunately fragmented, and those that need to use water are all too often not present in the dialogue or included when the decisions are made over those water resources. SEWE, again, you've heard me say this a couple of times this week. SEWE is really strongly supporting and actively working for greater diversity of stakeholders within water dialogues and in all discussions that relate to that. We want to include women, youth, underrepresented groups, indigenous populations, in water diplomacy processes in order really to enable stronger cooperation. Only by hearing all voices and perspectives will these decisions be the right decisions. We know that the effects of climate change are primarily felt through the water cycle, and the water cycle has been altered by human activity. Environmental health is, of course, critical for people and ecological integrity. The value of water for peace and stability is absolutely critical to address all of these challenges. Well-planned water-related mitigation and adaptation can reduce tensions, mitigate risks for conflict, and contribute positively to peace and good cooperation. Fostering an understanding of the value of water and a healthy environment, we see can be an entry point for strengthening peace by advancing the capacity to proactively manage and mitigate security risks that are posed by environmental degradation and climate change. At SEWE, we strongly believe that on-the-ground action and preventive diplomacy can reduce tensions that are currently worsened by the impacts of climate change. With today's high-level panel, I am very happy to see that we will deep dive and explore more on the commitments made during the UN Water Conference and its Water Action Agenda earlier this year in March, how we can support actors in and outside of the water sector to contribute to peace and conflict prevention. I'm looking forward to gaining new insights on how we can better address these growing challenges and how we can do that together. At SEWE, we are committed to supporting governments, basin organizations, and all relevant stakeholders with a tailored capacity development and dialogue support for a wide range of activities related to cooperation over shared water resources. We're doing this as inclusively as we can in all of these processes, by knowledge development, including research over water cooperation, water diplomacy, and not least, water governance. This high-level panel is part of our commitment to raise the attention to issues of governance and the need for cooperation in transboundary contexts, And we want to highlight alternative approaches to face the complexity of water, peace, and stability, and the interlinkages between these dimensions. So thank you everyone for joining here and online. And I would now like to warmly welcome the keynote speaker at this high-level panel, Mr. Hussein Yusuf Ali, the Director of Policy and Planning and Executive Secretary of Transboundary Water Diplomacy Committee from the Federal Republic of Somalia. Mr. Ali is speaking on behalf of the... That happens too. We had a fire alarm yesterday. This was a glass of water. There we go. I was saying that Mr. Ali is speaking on behalf of the State Minister from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation of the Federal Republic of Somalia, Mr. Ali Mohammed Omar, who was unfortunately unable to be here with us today in person. But please join me in welcoming Mr. Hussein Yusuf Ali on stage. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, good morning, all of you. It's my great pleasure to address the World Water Week conference in Stockholm, Sweden. Today, I stand before you as the representative of Somalia, a nation that has experienced firsthand of the profound impacts of water scarcity and flooding. I would like to shed light on the pressing issues we face and emphasize the urgent need for collective action to address these challenges. Water is a fundamental human right and a key to sustainable development. It's essential for life, health, economic growth, peace, and security, and the promotion of human rights. However, the world is facing a severe water crisis, with millions of people lacking access to clean water and many more suffering from water scarcity and pollution. The United Nations estimates that by 2025, half of the world's population will be living in water-stressed areas. This crisis is not only a humanitarian issue, but also a threat to global security and stability. Historically, water has been available even in areas prone to drought, and flooding followed a predictable pattern. However, as the climate warms, we are witnessing a disturbing trend of more extreme weather events, resulting in either too little or too much water. This has far-reaching consequences that affect not only the environment, but also the lives and the livelihoods of millions of people around the world. It's imperative that we put water at the heart of our nation, our action plans as policymakers. Sustainable water management is not only crucial for addressing to climate change and building resilience, but also for protecting health and saving lives. Furthermore, it plays a vital role in mitigating climate change itself by protecting ecosystems and reducing carbon emissions from water, sanitation, transportation, and treatment. Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, to address these challenges effectively, politicians must cooperate across national borders to balance the water needs of communities, industry, agriculture, and ecosystems. We must work together to develop comprehensive strategies that prioritize sustainable water management, promote and share efficient water use, and invest in infrastructure to ensure access to clean water for all. Water scarcity and pollution have far-reaching consequences, affecting everything from food security to public health. Lack of access to clean water can lead to the spread of waterborne diseases such as cholera and typhoid fever, which can be fatal. It can also lead to malnutrition, as water is essential for growing crops and raising livestock. In addition, water scarcity can lead to conflicts over water resources, exacerbating the existing political tensions and instability. The combined impacts of water shortage and flooding have affected all dimensions of people's lives, particularly in countries and regions with weak institutions and inefficient water governance. In recent years, we have witnessed an increase in water-related crises, severe water shortage due to drought and sudden flooding as a result of heavy rains. Climate change is aggravating both water scarcity and water-related hazards, while floods and droughts are now sudden, unforeseen events and increasingly hit areas in quick succession. Honorable guests, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, to address this crisis, we need to conserve water, manage it sustainably, and ensure equitable access to clean water for all. This requires a multifaceted approach that involves governments, NGOs, communities, and individuals. We need to invest in water infrastructure, promote and share water-saving technologies, and raise awareness about the importance of water conservation. We also need to ensure that water is prioritized as a fundamental human right and a key to sustainable development. We must also recognize the interconnectedness between water, climate change, and other pressing global issues. As a country that has suffered from water scarcity and drought, Somalia understands the importance of water conservation and sustainable management. We have taken steps to address this issue, such as preparing some of the basic policy documents for relevant ministries, finding funds for small-scale water infrastructure, and raising awareness about the importance of water conservation. As climate change is severely affecting our country more than others, and as our socioeconomic activity is almost entirely based on water, Somalia is also keen to cooperate over the climate and water issues. However, we cannot do this alone. We need the support of the international community to address this crisis. We need to work together to find innovative solutions and ensure that water is prioritized as a fundamental human right and a key to sustainable development. Honorable guests, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, I would like to express my gratitude to the organizers of this important meeting, the Stockholm International Water Institute, SIWI, the contributors, and the participants for fostering collaboration, inspiring innovation, and accelerating water action. Let's all seize this opportunity to strengthen cooperation, share knowledge, and find sustainable solutions to the water-related crisis issues we all face. In conclusion, the time for action is now. We cannot afford to ignore the growing water crisis that threatens the well-being of communities worldwide. Let us seize this opportunity to come together, share knowledge and experiences, and forge partnerships to pave the way for a sustainable and water-secure future. Together, we can make a difference and ensure that clean water remains a fundamental right for every individual on this planet. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Yusuf Ali, for this. Thank you very much for highlighting the need for water to be prioritized and to be prioritized across the board. And thank you also so much for putting at the forefront of what you said this balance between the water hardware, the pipelines, the dams, the constructions, the infrastructure of water, and the fundamental aspect of that being combined and complemented by the software, the governments, the institutions, the capacity developments for the management of the water resources to be effective and deliver results. So thank you so much for putting that on the map. Without further ado, I'm happy to introduce and welcome on stage another familiar face this week. Arati, welcome. She will be the moderator of today's high-level panel. Arati?
Thank you so much. Today's first panel is going to focus on transboundary cooperation for environment and sustainability. I'd like to welcome to the stage Ms. Fatou Dieng, Climate Advisor to the United Nations, Secretary General, Gambian Gender Negotiator at the UNFCCC, and founder of Clean Earth Gambia. Fatou, if you could sit next to me right here. Next, I'd like to invite on the stage Ms. Radhika Fox, Assistant Administrator of the Environment Protection Agency for Water, United States Government. Llewellyn Martin, Director, Urban and International Water, Australian Department of Climate Change, Energy, Environment and Water. It looks like we are one seat short, so I will stand at the podium and I will welcome to the stage Amutaz Abadi, Deputy Secretary General, Union of the Mediterranean, for the Mediterranean. We are solving this as we speak.
Always to have a seat, I have difficulty.
While we wait for the seat to be placed, I wanted to reflect on both the Stockholm Water Prize this morning and what we heard from the keynote just now. One of the Stockholm laureates talked about his business model and how he was developing his business model and how the intended consequences of his product was not reaching fruition. And the quote I was really struck by is, out of desperation, we pivoted. And that changed everything. And I think that can be a really good scene setter for today's discussion. And of course, what we heard Mr. Ali say is that politicians have to come together, shake hands, and actually put water at the heart of the political agenda to make these changes possible. So my first question, now I will sit since we're all seated. So my first question to all of you is to say, what in your role and in the work that you do is at the heart of creating peace and stability from a water perspective? And what do you see need to be done? Fatou, I'm going to ask you to set the stage with a few words, and then we'll open up to the rest of the panel.
Thank you so much for having me, and good morning, everyone. Just to share that I come from a region that is one of the most disproportionately impacted by the climate crisis. I come from the Gambia, a tiny country in West Africa and in the Sahel. And over the years, we have been experiencing the devastating impact of not only water insecurity, but also climate change. I am a daughter of a farmer. My father has always been a farmer. But over the years, his main source of income, his main source of livelihood, was impacted because of climate change, drought, and many other issues. So I grew up seeing how the impacts of climate change really affected our main source of income and survival. And sub-Saharan Africa right now is not only facing issues concerning climate change, but also water insecurity is one of the major issues that have been leading to other humanitarian crises. FAO has reported that nearly 40% of our population in sub-Saharan Africa do not have access to safe drinking water. And over 300 million people do not have access to improve water sources. And over 70% of our population as well without adequate sanitation. This is really alarming. This is really sad. And at the end of the day, it is always the most vulnerable groups, that is women, youth, and children, that are impacted. Violence, again, contributed by water insecurity actually rose from 200,000 in kind of like 2013 to 2.1 million in 2021, according to the UNHCR. So, as I always say, the numbers do not actually lie. And we continue to see how climate change and water insecurity continues to affect our main source of survival, our main source of income, and just our livelihoods. Just last year as well as years before as well, during the rainy season, in the Gambia, a lot of people actually lost their lives in their homes, and people were actually displaced. And we continue to see in other parts of Africa as well, we continue to see an increase in violence, an increase in displacement, migration, gender-based violence, among others, which are all triggered by water insecurity. And as a young person that actually founded a youth organization 6 years ago, I was able to mobilize youth in the Gambia to advocate for the lives and livelihoods of communities and build our resilience to address not only the climate change problems that we're facing, but also other environmental threats that we're facing. And I see water as a key stabilizing force in achieving peace and just stability around the world. And I believe, as a young person, I have an important role to play in not only putting pressure on our leaders, because we sit in meetings, we make policies, we make promises, but at the end of the day, when we go back to our home countries, and these are places that actually matters the most, we fail to deliver on the promises that we have made at the local level to support and build the resilience of our communities. So I believe water stability is very crucial in our lives, and also ensuring that people have a healthy life and a healthy future. So I always say water is not only a main source of sustenance, but it is also a stabilizing factor for peace and global stability, just global security. And it is a fundamental human right for our people. Healthy environment as well is a fundamental and basic human right for our people. And globally, we need to make sure we collaborate, we work together, we synergize, and build our efforts to make sure the countries that matters the most disproportionate countries, the most vulnerable countries, are supported to ensure that we don't continue to face the challenges that we're facing. Because if one country is affected, or if one region is affected, and we don't find solution, I think it's going to actually go at a global level. So collaboration is really important, and ensuring that the promises that are made are kept and are fulfilled.
But what you say in terms of giving voice to the voiceless and actually showcasing things that might be small in numbers but actually a huge impact, that's critical, and putting pressure on leaders. And with that, Radhika, I come to you to say, from the US perspective and the current administration, what are the actions that you'll be taking for water in terms of peace and stability?
Well, first of all, I just want to thank you for this important discussion, and to Siwi for the invitation to join. This is actually my first time coming to World Water Week, and you know, it is such a profound reminder of the interconnectedness of all of us, and that at the end of the day, we all breathe the same air, we all drink the same water, our children all play on the same land. So I just want to thank Siwi for bringing us all together. Certainly under President Biden's leadership, climate ambition and climate action is front and center, and we are working. We are trying to work to be stronger partners to issues of peace and conflict in the international community. But I wanted to talk a little bit about what my role is at the US EPA. So I'm responsible for managing the domestic water program for the United States. And so I'm responsible for both regulating and protecting drinking water, surface waters, all across the United States, for leading investment in water infrastructure. And because of President Biden's bipartisan infrastructure law, we're investing $50 billion in local water systems all across the United States. This is the largest investment that we've made. And while the United States is certainly a nation of great abundance, the reality, though, is that there are millions of people all across the country that are living with water insecurity, still living, without basic water infrastructure. And I think for our president, that's unacceptable. For a nation of such abundance, and so. What we have been prioritizing is how do we ensure that low-income people, communities of color, whether in rural areas, in urban centers, have access to these resources. What people may not realize is that in the United States today, we have communities like Lowndes County, Alabama, where water infrastructure never came. And we have children who are living in communities where the wastewater infrastructure is right there in the yards in which they're playing. And so what we have focused on is essentially taking all of these resources, prioritizing investments. Half of these investments must be invested in disadvantaged communities, and doing that in a way that centers the decision-making around these resources with those communities. So it is, frankly, a new day as far as the domestic agenda as it relates to water, and I, again, look forward to the discussion we're about to have.
I think that's a really positive statement to move on from and say that there's a lot happening in the right direction, but of course, averages, like you say, are misleading. They need to be investigated, unpacked to really see where vulnerability is. Luann, I'll come to you next.
Yeah, thanks so much, Arati. And I guess in thinking about this issue, the role that water can play for peace and stability, I suppose, my starting point is that, well, water is life, isn't it? I mean, we know that water underpins every aspect of our societies and our economies and our health and our well-being, our food security. So I think it follows that where people have access to the right amount of water of the right quality in order to meet all their various needs, then that's something that is conducive to peaceful outcomes. But conversely, if people don't have enough water, if the water's polluted, if it's too much in the form of a disaster, then naturally that gives rise to competition and to discontent. And I think this is where governments have a really important role. Governments need to implement mechanisms that are effective in helping to manage that competition and to resolve discontent where it arises and address water-related issues. So I guess just sort of turning to the role of my department. So I work for the Australian Department of Climate Change, Energy, Environment and Water, and we have a mandate to sustainably manage Australia's water resources. We don't have the sort of same international boundaries to manage like other countries have, but we do have within our largest and most important water basin, we have a number of subnational governments, so we've got sort of complex issues to manage there. And I guess in terms of the way we work, I think it sort of contributes to peace and stability in a few ways, because firstly, we're responsible for taking forward a water reform agenda that involves implementing really hard-won agreements that are the result of sort of political processes and political settlements. And the policies and the programs that flow from these agreements have major impacts for individuals and for communities and for industries in the way they use water. So it's really critical that we do our work transparently and inclusively so that we can, maintain that public trust that's so important for peace and stability. I think the other thing is that, in Australia, we've had a few wet years, but we know our next drought is right around the corner. And so it's important that we use all the tools that we have available to us to prepare to protect our water security and to ensure that water will be available for every Australian to meet their basic needs. And I think, again, where there's that confidence in the public that we're ready to meet our challenges, that is a stabilising force as well. And I guess just finally in Australia, we are working to implement policies to address some of the impacts of the dispossession of our First Nations people from their lands and their waters. And it's early days for us. We've got a long way to go. But it's the hope of the Australian government that this work will lead to better and fairer and just and more enduring outcomes.
So in terms of what you say in terms of competition and conflict and of course finding water resolutions, that of course resonates with everything that the speakers before you've said as well. And Almutaz, you deal with one of the most water scarce regions. How is this working with the Union of the Mediterranean?
Thank you very much. And first, I am very happy to be the only man with the ladies here.
And the last word.
And also to talk about the region that brings together three continents like Europe and European Union and West Asia and North Africa, whereas everybody knows that this is the place where culture started in the world, but also at the same time, I think this is the place that also creates the resilience because of the environmental condition around the Mediterranean. Especially now, all studies, especially the one that we conducted with MEDIC, they are giving us an alarming figures about how climate change is translated in the Mediterranean, which is beyond many things. It is about the more scarce situation, less water coming to the Mediterranean, or too much water coming to the other part of the Mediterranean that create problems of the water management and to bring water to the citizen. There were two key words today, one coming from you, how to put the water at the heart of the political agenda, and the other one from our gentleman from Somalia, who said that we need to have water as a human right. Between the two, there are two things we believe in the Union for the Mediterranean that should be done. The first one, for the politician, I think that we need to let them understand what is the value of water in terms of dollar sign. And this is something that we are working on through our program on water finance and investment. The numbers, sometimes it's not good to steal them, but sometimes they are important. There are studies related to this. If we want to invest in the water sector, $1, from now until 2050, we can have $6.8 to $7 in return. Look at this investment. If somebody will tell you, let us invest on this condition, you will put all your money on there. So if you are a politician and you know these figures, you should also start bringing the Minister of Water beside you in the small kitchen in order to achieve the water security, because as mentioned by all our colleagues, that to stabilize situation, you need to have affordable services. And here is the second point. For human right approach to water is not necessarily that people need to have a water for free. No, the water should be paid and accessed, but on something we call it affordability. And to achieve affordability here is the situation that you need to look after the management and the policies that we put on place at national level, and also these elements that we can connect them together between different regions and different entities around the Mediterranean. So another World Bank study said clearly that if we keep doing business as usual, then we are going to lose 2 to 10% of our GDP until 2050. So then if we don't want to lose this amount, we have to focus on changing the narrative and the way to manage our resources. And to manage these resources, I am not trying to promote that water is a good and it's kind to be like Coca-Cola, no. But I think what is need to be done all around the world, and especially now with the crisis that we face, that we have to follow a commercial-based approach, non-profit, when we set our utilities. And this is very evident through this dialogue that we are doing in the Union for the Mediterranean. We bring together countries. Honestly speaking, I am not going to be very optimistic, but also I don't want to be pessimistic, because we have 3 to 4 countries in the Union for the Mediterranean, the 43 member states. They were listed as one of the 10 poorest countries in the world. But at the same time, if you look at certain countries, that they manage to cope with the crisis, not by making only more water, following desalination or to do something, but it's very important to look after setting up institutions. And
I think what you're saying is really important. You're saying that we have to give, and it's interesting because it's going to be a little bit provoking now. Water has to be seen with its commercial value, no doubt. At the same time, if we bring equity into the discussion, how do we actually make sure everyone is being seen, heard, and serviced in terms of water as a human right? And we have a lot to learn from and to work with. In fact, I want to come to you because you are working with the youth and with women and actually doing things on the ground. What, in this sense, and what you've heard today in terms of equity, in terms of resource sharing, in terms of commercial value of water being understood by the business industry, What can we do to actually include the people that you want to bring into the radar? And I have actually a follow-up question, because everyone's bringing out studies. Everyone's bringing out numbers from studies. And these come from vulnerable areas. But there's also a lot of gatekeeping of science being fed back to these vulnerable areas. What do you want to see being done there as well?
Thank you so much. Obviously, our speakers have mentioned how water insecurity is affecting the most vulnerable communities. And as you've mentioned, I work with the most impacted communities in the Gambia, including youth, rural, and poor communities. And over the years, as a frontline activist, leading projects in these communities, I have seen how they have actually been left out in the conversations and even just in the delivery of projects that actually affects or is most important to them. For instance, in 2021, my organization was aware of sort of like an invasion of a fixed meal factory in the Gambia that is like a corporation that was trying to take over the land of women farmers. And just to mention, Gambia is a country where many people depend on agriculture, but in the workforce, women actually constitute the majority in this sector. And with this that actually happened in 2021, these were lands of women farmers that they have actually used for like over 30 years. And coming from a country where we understand that our families actually engage in these activities to like send their children to school, to support their children, we understand how important this really is for these women. So when we heard about this campaign, we actually worked with the young people. It was in Gunjur, a coastal zone which is affected by climate change as well as some other environmental threats. So when we heard about this campaign and understanding the importance of supporting these women that are actually vulnerable to climate change, we kind of like mobilized youth across the country, as well as the community that was impacted, that is the youth of Gunjur, and did a massive social media campaign. So with that, we were actually able to get the attention of politicians, we were able to get the attention of the media, as well as the private sector, showing the power of young people, or just our role, ensuring that the voices of the most vulnerable communities are heard. So when we did that, we were able to get the support of different communities, and at the end of the day, these women farmers were able to get back their land. So this, just to give an example of how us as young people could ensure or make sure that at least the communities that are affected are brought forward. So in the global conversation, just to come to your question, how can we make sure that they are brought forward? So what I've observed in my work as an activist is when we sit in conversations talking about things that affect these communities, I've observed that they have always or more or less been left out in the conversations. We don't see them on the table. We have others come and speak for them, which I think should not be the case, because as I always say, she who feels it knows it. So they are better to speak for themselves than to have others speak for themselves. So including them and ensuring that they are involved in the conversation really matters. And also, as someone that has actually delivered projects, I've observed that most of the time when projects, especially related to climate change, environmental issues, or just even water-related issues, I've observed that when projects are delivered, these communities are not really consulted. They just come and implement the project. And at the end of the day, there is no ownership. And for us to be able to ensure that there is effective resilience, we need to ensure that there is ownership of projects that are delivered for communities. So let us ensure that there is ownership for them, their inclusion, their sort of like consultation to ensure that we are able to give them what they deserve or what they need the most in terms of having a healthy life and a healthy environment.
And that's a great segue to you, Arati, because of course you're sitting at the national level. And these are voices coming out from the local level saying there is work to be done. We want to highlight what can be done. And I love what you say, she who feels it knows it. How do you balance that between the national, the state, and the local?
Yes. Well, first of all, I agree with everything that you have said. And so, one of the things to, now figure out being in this national role is how do you, within the context of a national government, embed and institutionalize the wisdom, the voice, and the experience of low-income people, communities of color, the most vulnerable in our country, in the choices that we're making around water management. And so, a couple of the ways that we've been trying to do it, and it's certainly only a start, is first, I think this theme of inclusiveness and inclusive leadership matters. So first and foremost, when the president took office, he said, I'm going to build a administration that reflects the diversity of our nation. And so I came from a water equity advocacy organization. We actually have some of the partners from that work from Cleveland and others here in the audience. So I come from an advocacy perspective, and I'm now his water chief. I'm the first woman of color to ever be in this role. So I think inclusive leadership matters. Second is, we've established the White House Environmental Justice Council. This is a council of frontline organizations from communities across the United States, and they are charged with advising all of the agencies on how we embed equity and environmental justice. And this is the President's Council, right? So that's another way we're trying to embed change and equity into how we're doing things. We are guided by a number of executive orders. We have the first ever executive order on racial equity, which really charges each agency to think about racial equity and injustice in the context of the choices that we are making. We have what we call Justice 40, which is an initiative where across all of the agencies, 40% of investments must flow to disadvantaged and underserved communities. It's the first time we've ever done that. So this is just getting started. And one example in the context of the water program, and to link to the conversations yesterday on tribal water issues, one of the things that we did in my first year in office is establish the first ever tribal water action plan. And it really is the U.S.'s commitment to a different and equal relationship around water issues with sovereign nations.
I think I'm going to stop you there, but I wanted to make sure you mentioned the tribal action plan. So now I can say, Luella, I want to come to you, because of course the First Nations conversation that you started in the beginning and talking about how do you get these cultural perspectives together to create peace and stability within the region. I'd like to ask you, how is Australia doing that?
Yeah, thank you. Well, yeah, Australia completely agrees that inclusive approaches to water management are absolutely critical, because at the end of the day, everyone values water differently. Water means something different to individuals and communities at different points in time, and the only way to really understand what that meaning is to someone is to ask them and to listen to their answer. And I mean, that's a simplistic statement. Of course, it's not always an easy thing to do, but I think that has to be at the heart of our approaches to water management and water decision making. And I guess, as an Aboriginal woman, I know that when we're talking about cultural values and, reflecting on Australia's First Nations, it's really important to understand that one nation's cultural needs will be different to another's. So if we're talking about an inclusive approach, talking to one nation doesn't mean that it's inclusive. You need to talk to all impacted nations because they will have different needs and different values associated with water. And, there is value in going to the effort of doing this, of these inclusive approaches, because I think when everyone feels that they've had a chance to put forth their views and participate in decision-making around water issues that affect them, you're obviously going to come to solutions that are more enduring because they're better supported. And I think the other key point is that it gives inclusive processes give decision makers a much stronger and richer basis of information on which to make their decisions, because it's much broader. And reflecting on some of the sessions yesterday, I had the privilege to be involved in a session on two-eyed seeing, which talked about the traditional knowledge. And, I think one of the things that everyone took away was just the sheer depth of information that First Nations knowledge holders have about the natural environment that is of cultural significance to them, which shouldn't come as a surprise because traditional knowledge is the accumulation of knowledge and information and observations passed down through generations over thousands of years. But I mention this because these are the kinds of inputs into decision-making processes that we have available to us should we be able to adapt our processes to be inclusive. And I think the challenge for, for
Almataz is going to get that challenge.
Yeah, please.
What we've heard now, speakers before you, is representation, diversity, inclusion will automatically inform better decision-making. And you have before you 3 powerful, influential decision-makers that will see that change. My last question to you, sitting in the seat of cultural history, like you said, what do you want to see as a concrete next step, taking these conversations forward? And what would you like to see in terms of water moving towards a peace and security system?
Thank you. Actually, for what we want to see that there is something, we call it the whole of society approach, where we're bringing together what you start with the youth, the young people, because in our perspective in the Mediterranean region, we found out that like more than 60 to 70% of people are classified as young people. 30% of them are jobless. And then if you wanted to achieve stability, you have to convert and translate water into jobs. Yeah? And where we sit in Barcelona, and now the hot potato is the migration, and migration also creates this unstable situation. And then I think investment on things related to entrepreneurials and bringing young people to invest and to create their small, medium enterprises on the water sector. And here when we say about water sector, water can be also blue economy, can be green economy, all different aspects. We worked with many of people actually sitting around us here through support from the Swedish Development Agency, MENA region, to enhance the perception of how government can create enabling environment for young people to start their enterprises. There are scary movies around that because only 40% of these trials to set up small, medium enterprises were successful, the rest were failed, not because only the capacity of the young people, so we need to invest in the capacity to enable them how to put these systems, but also the legislation that when you register those SMEs then need to be tackled. Recently, the Union for the Mediterranean had labeled a project called Smart Desert. Smart Desert project in Jordan, funded by the AFD, and also we have support of SIDA on that. The concept is how to support Palestinian refugee in Jordan and also Syrian and marginalized family in order to create their home-based business based on the agricultural activity that they are doing. And that is very important to be done and replicated all around the world, how to stabilize the situation by creating more jobs and affordable water services.
Scale, replication, and government as an enabling factor. I think that's a really strong message to send to the audience as we close this panel. And I'd like, ladies and gentlemen, for you to join me in giving everyone a warm hand of applause, and thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you.
As I thank our panelists, I will call up the next panel session speakers. Find my cards. So our second panel will be economy, environment, and benefit sharing. I think Almataz actually was resonating the importance of value as a commodity, water as a commodity, and to value it well will also help us to understand how to create peace and stability in different arenas. So I'm going to welcome on stage Ms. Tanja Miskova, Ambassador at Large for Water Diplomacy of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Slovenia. Lenka Tame, Executive Secretary, Orange Senku River Commission. And James Dalton, Head of Water Management, International Union for the Conservation of Nature. And as a start to today's panel, we actually are going to have a question from the audience that's been submitted beforehand. And Gustav from Civi will be giving us that question. Gustav, I see you right there.
So the question is, if you look ahead to 2030, where will the world stand on transboundary water cooperation and water security? Thank you.
And Gustav, who is that question to? To everyone?
So I think that is to the panel, yes.
Okay. So if you can just repeat it one more time so everyone can hear it. Maybe come a little bit closer.
Okay. So the question is, if you look ahead to 2030, where will the world stand on transboundary water cooperation and water security? Thanks.
Good one to start with. Did you hear the question?
Yes.
If we look ahead to 2030, Tanya, I'm going to start with you.
That's a tough one. You want to hear the optimistic or...
Always optimistic.
Yeah. Well, in Slovenia, my country, was one of the members of the Transboundary Water Cooperation Coalition. And we established this coalition with the exact aim to promote the transboundary water cooperation, because we had the feeling that the trends were not exactly positive. At best, they were stagnating. And when you compare that with the challenges, with the mounting challenges, and especially a big concern of mine is the lack of agreement on the transboundary aquifers. About 500-600 of them, and only 12 agreements worldwide. So I think this is a big concern, and a lot of work to do for water diplomacy. So that's the best answer I can give you at the moment.
Linke.
Yes, thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to make an input to this very important topic. I think I'll take it from the positive side. To say that I think there is very good signs of cooperation happening. Yes, as the delegate from Slovenia has mentioned, maybe groundwater is lagging behind a little bit, but I think we as water engineers / water diplomacy officials are seeing more and more need for the conjunctive use of surface water and groundwater, and that is inspiring a lot of the cooperation arrangements which are emerging in that area as well. So I think as we head to 2030, there should be some positive thought that hopefully water cooperation or transboundary water cooperation will start yielding very good results for humanity as a whole. Thank you.
Thank you. James, I'm going to ask the same question to you from the audience, but I just want to add to that. In recent studies, when it came to kind of looking at peace and conflict with relation to environment, there was a claim made that the environment community was actually slow to adopt the understanding of peace and conflict when it came to water, and in this case, transboundary. So to add your comments on that.
Sure. So I think I take an optimistic viewpoint, and I think actually by 2030 there'll be more cooperation, and I think that's not just transnationally, but I think also nationally, because agencies internally will have to start cooperating better on water and understanding it. So I do believe that cooperation will increase. I don't think, however, sadly, that we will be in a better situation of dealing with water security, because I just don't think that the reform that we are slowly seeing and that needs to accelerate will be able to keep up with the climate impacts on water resources. And I think that's the problem. We will be pedaling as fast as we can, but we will still not be able to deal with the impacts of climate. And I think that's really a call to action on dealing with that. On the environmental side of things, I think from an environmental perspective, one of the things that, there are 7,000 conflicts over the last 30 years globally. These are sort of statistics from before the sort of Ukraine situation. And generally, they follow a certain cycle, and within that, environment is either something that is used in a conflict situation, or is a cause within a conflict situation, or is something that is affected post-conflict when things need to be rebuilt or when you're moving people around. The impact of displacement is a huge impact on the environment. So I think that the environmental sector has, I agree, been slow to deal with the implications of that. But in some cases, when you look at where there are borders, if you look at the situation between North Korea and the Korean and South Korea, that particular area, the demilitarized zone, is effectively a protected area, which has amazing wildlife and biodiversity recovery in it. So there are some positives from it, although they are sporadic. One of the things that I think is most concerning at the moment is this tipping point. So we're seeing, it was mentioned in the first panel, but also out of the UN Water Conference, a lot more interest in inclusivity, indigenous peoples groups being represented, and a full range of understanding of governance and historical knowledge to improve how we manage water resources. But at the same time, globally, we're seeing a much greater threat on environmental defenders. More of them nowadays are killed, are put in jail, are under pressure globally across the world. People trying to protect land, protect people on land, react to infrastructure that they feel is damaging or negative. So there is a reconciliation needed in that process as well, which is beyond just purely water, but is at the broader environmental scale.
And also, of course, that's economic justice as well when it comes to being threatened when you feel that your private properties being embarked upon. So how do you create and descale and de-escalate that fear that comes with some of these challenges? And Lenka, I actually want to come to you for some positive examples, because of course there's a lot of, and you said we should be able to, rather than we can. So you of course worked in the African area for a long time and had discussions about riparian rights and worked with how to create transboundary frameworks. What are the positive examples you've seen there that could be replicated as we move forward?
I think where I would start on that conversation would really be around our countries. I come from Southern Africa, so I will have a bias on my way of thinking in that direction, in that historically our countries, our communities have always been together. Some of the boundaries that have been drawn are, passing through communities that are otherwise related in many other ways. So you see very deep interdependencies, not only between the communities, but even between the countries themselves. And then you have water resources distribution in our region, where inevitably some countries have to depend on others because either the water source is in another geographic space, which is a different country, and it coming to a country which does not add a lot in terms of rainfall or precipitation for that matter. So the interdependency, it becomes a very critical element, and that pushes or fosters cooperation on water in our region at least. So that is where I come in with my thinking around the positivity around water diplomacy or water relationships. But even beyond the water sector, we have the energy sector where we have interconnected grids. At this point in time, I know many of our countries in Southern Africa are having shortages of power, and water becomes one of the ingredients that helps in addressing those challenges because of the hydropower you can utilize in this instance, and so on. And the impact of climate change, of course, is impacting on all of us, but we hope that through the joint and cooperative efforts on water, we are more ready to address some of the challenges that we see, either in terms of extreme droughts or extreme floods.
So I'm going to push you a little bit more. In terms of these channels, you talked about the interdependencies being the trigger and the leverage point to bring riparian states together. What are some of the outcomes, both from formal channels and informal channels, that have resulted in positive benefits, given that the understanding by all parties is that we need to share this resource?
Yes. Well, I could quote specific actions on the ground, but you do get quite several examples in Southern Africa where countries have worked together to harness the endowment of water in one part of the sub-region, like in Lesotho, my home country, by the way, and exporting some of those endowments in terms of water to other neighboring countries which need the water a lot more. but you also have cooperation, for instance, between Botswana, Namibia, and South Africa on groundwater, where they are recognizing the importance of this transboundary groundwater system, which they need to manage together in order to optimize the use of that resource. Yes.
So this collaborative working on transboundary issues, I want to come to you, James, in terms of working with your members and how you're engaging transboundary action across different states and different geographies.
Sure. So I think there's probably three short key examples. One is that we've always tried to work in a level of multi-level governance for water. State-to-state cooperation is one thing that sets the sort of rules of the game, but the reality in the river basins can be often quite different. So working with local stakeholders who may share cultural connection, family connection, before those borders existed, is critically important because they're actually very aware of the river basin very locally. I was once in a country and I'd met the Minister of Environment at the time, and he told me that the policy for groundwater drilling was in place and everything was fine. 2 hours drive away, there were more drills put up for boreholes than there were trees. So when we went back to the ministry and we pointed out that actually maybe the policy needed to be further communicated to people and that there could be some mild enforcement just to explain to people the challenge, there was the belief that no, it was in place. And I think the problem is that we believe that, almost, and I'll take a reference from Star Trek here, the sort of make it so number one approach, that I've got a policy, it's approved and passed, let's put it into place, it's working now. But the time it takes for this to have the real impact is too long, because there's not enough follow-up and enforcement and education and working with stakeholders to understand what are their alternatives, what's the incentive for them to change practices. So we try and work at multiple scales with communities, with local authorities and regional bodies to try and improve the governance of water that ultimately, at the end of the day, helps fulfill that state-to-state mandate of cooperation. But it doesn't always work because we sometimes find challenges that you have to deal with which are historical. There is one example I know in northern Nigeria for the Komadugu-Yobe River Basin, shared between Nigeria, a little bit of Niger, and then flowing into Lake Chad. And there is a dam built there in the late 60s, early 70s by a well-known multilateral finance institution, shall we say. But 1 year of hydrological data was used to build that dam, and it was the wettest year for 30 years. And the dam never filled. And so the follow-on investment in irrigation then had loads of impacts for a 300-kilometer stretch of river that affected cities, towns, local communities, and into the next states. So the implications of that was on tensions. There was a poor understanding of the implications of how farmers would change practices to suddenly having water constantly available from a dam. And so in that case, we had to work with local stakeholders and the states who set up a fund to try and manage the situation, to clean the river system out, to remove the weeds. This stagnant water that was no longer flowing because of the dam was causing lots of problems. So mobilizing local communities, mobilizing municipalities to actually deal with a good, solid, sensible idea that was poorly put into place and practice that had local to national to international conflict resonations. So these are the sort of challenges that we try and deal with at this multi-level scale.
And also it's really important what you were saying, because of course it's the time sensitivity of that data. And how do you create the reaction that is flexible enough to actually engage so that you can actually prevent and create resilience on the ground? And I want to come to you, Lenka, in the same idea, because of course as a Secretariat for River Basin Organization, you build these basin plans, of course, and you work with different stakeholders, try and engage them to actually be part of that resilience planning. What are your takeaways from what James is saying in terms of how do you get the correct data to be put into place?
I think one of the big challenges, either working at the national level or a river basin level, is trying to strike a balance between the reality that you don't have the means to gather as much data as you would wish, but at the same time you still have to advance the plans and build infrastructure as and when required. So yes, we are seeing a number of innovations coming up, remote sensing and other tools that colleagues are bringing into the space, but data gathering still remains a big challenge, and you really wish to use that which you have to keep moving on forward, but you have to also incorporate more data gathering as part of your planning processes, that you plan with what you have, but you also incorporate data gathering as part of your future actions to build on the amount of knowledge and the robustness of the actions that have to be undertaken. So yes, it's very true that data is a challenge, but recognizing that as a necessary action to us is very important. But getting the countries to work together in a cooperative way in planning with the limited data that you have, but still moving forward. Yeah. So it's not easy. It's not easy.
Oh,
yeah.
That message is coming across very clearly. But Tanya, with that, from a government perspective, when you're trying to overcome these bottlenecks and trying to create this collaboration from points of common interest, what do you see as those challenges in terms of removing bottlenecks for negotiation?
Yeah, this depends on what the challenges are. And here I think, innovation is always welcome. And this is something we're going to discuss tomorrow at 9 o'clock at the talk show of the Transboundary Water Coalition. We're going to discuss innovation and how they can remove the bottlenecks, whether it's technological, government, innovation and governance, social innovation. Because, for example, if you're talking about climate change effects, of course, this can, stir nationalism, water nationalism. It can, raise tensions, especially if we're talking about if there's lack of cooperative mechanism, or if there is no trust and they're not really effective. Then, for example, the downstream country can suspect the upstream country in using the climate change as an excuse of not sending enough water downstream. But if you have effective transboundary mechanisms in place, which are transparent, equitable, just and inclusive, then this tension can well be avoided. For example, in some basins, you have very, the countries, there are cooperative mechanisms, but they are very imbalanced. There is one, usually the upstream countries, that is dominant. Technological innovation can actually help the downstream country, for example, in this case, change this position, by implementing solutions that make it no longer depending on the upstream country. And this can change, shift the balance and level out the playing field and pave the way to more equitable cooperation. In basins where there is lack of trust, climate change can be a good entry point in terms of doing a joint vulnerability risk assessment analysis, scenario modeling, whatever works, to bring maybe just for the beginning the scientists together to come up with a joint analysis, and from that propose a joint solution with the joint data they all trust. So these are just some of the entry points that also within the coalition we're trying to identify and share and promote.
So trust, transparency, and of course engaging all stakeholders. And as a last question to all of you, sitting here looking ahead 365 days to when you'll be back on this panel, I hope, discussing peace and stability within the water and environment sector, what is the gap that can be filled and should be filled by decision makers that you would like to see actualized and operationalized? James, I'm going to start with you.
I think probably first I'd like to see a look at national policy reviews for water, because most of them are out of date and they're certainly not climate ready. And it goes back to the first point. I think we can cooperate and I think we can get better at that, and we are getting better at that. But we're not accelerating that fast enough to deal with the climate implications. So I think having a review of those policies to update exactly what we're going to be facing in the next 20, 30 years is going to be critical. And that will reframe what that cooperation needs to be. It's going to bring in other sectors understanding energy security, economic security, based upon those water risks. And it will help improve the collation of water interests nationally, rather than, I think, water always been slightly on the sideline. Incredibly valuable, but not necessarily having the power that it requires to improve water resources and that cooperation across states.
So reviewing policies where, when that's done with energy and environment, water will automatically be mainstream because it will be seen to be quite critical in the review.
I'm always conscious of the word mainstream because things tend to get forgotten. but I think it's more about putting water in around the same table as you would have energy security, economic security, and national security. Water security is fundamental to those three securities. So if it's not there, then it's always going to be forgotten, abused. It's an externality, or it's a fuel. It's a fuel for what we need, or it's feedstock for producing things, but it's never considered as a key security to those other elements that a country requires and the broader region and then continent needs.
Internalizing the water, value of water. Linka.
Yeah, to me, really just building on what he just mentioned, it's really the recognition that we, at least in the region where I come from, the interdependencies in the various other sectors is even more important sometimes. But, you know, water brings in a balancing act in our area because of the abundances in some areas and shortages in other areas. So it keeps bringing the countries together to work together on addressing the issues related to climate change. So I think with that recognition of the multi-sectoral interdependencies in our region, probably we'll still advance in a positive direction. Thank you.
So very similar to what James is saying, really, that this is an inter-cross-sectoral question. Yeah. And if that's understood, we're already moving in the right direction. Tanya, I'm going to end the panel with you.
Yeah, I'm going to agree with both because cross-sectoral cooperation is still one of the biggest challenges when it comes to water management and inclusivity. You know, I come from a country where it works relatively well, but it's really far, far, far from where it should be. And for it to be really effective, I mean, we heard it today from so many, it really needs to work. And finance. There's never enough money on the table, and yeah, that's a continuing challenge. Yeah.
So I think that ties up the two panels very closely, is that diversity, inclusion, representation, trust, and mainstream internalizing the value of water will be the way forward. Thank you so much for being with us today. Please join me in giving them a warm hand of applause. And with that, I would like to hand back to Karen Garth to take us to the end of the panel.
Thank you, Arati. And thank you to these two panels. I have the pleasure of welcoming with me on stage Stefan Löfven. Maybe we can take the two chairs in the middle.
Okay. You decide.
I'm the boss.
You're the boss.
Stefan Löfven is the chair of the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute's board of governing board, I should say. And we've heard two incredibly rich panel discussions.
Really.
And your task is to think of all of that, the back of your head, and try to answer difficult questions that I have for you. How is that?
That's fine. It should.
So I think we've heard very clearly that there are challenges.
Sure.
There are actually immense challenges. There are wars, there is climate change, there is environmental degradation, there is economic downturn, there are energy issues, food security, etc. But at the very opening of this year's World Water Week, I said that we should shy away from talking about problems and focusing on solutions, and that was going to be the theme of this week. How do you think that we can improve the current systems of global governance to be better prepared to meet these challenges, but also the emerging risks that we're seeing in the future?
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation, being here. I'm very glad to have listened to these panels as well. Well, I've had the privilege as well of co-chairing a high-level advisory board appointed by the Secretary General Guterres, together with
Ellen Johnson-Sirleaf.
Ellen Johnson-Sirleaf. And we dealt with that, governance and all that, because, I mean, we are in a very, very difficult situation, as the Secretary General describes as it's breakthrough or breakdown for the planet. Now, in our report, we said it must be a breakthrough, of course. And I fully agree with you, we need to focus more on solutions, what is possible to do. We need to be aware of the risk, of course. But I can see several solutions. We point at, first, we need to make multilateralism more, build more trust in the multilateral cooperation, because now we have too much of nationalism, or as I call regionalism. It's us, us, us. But these are issues that we need to cooperate on. I mean, climate and biodiversity, pollution, water, energy, all that is something that we need to see together. So we need to gather under the UN flag. That does not mean that everything should be done or decided in New York City, but we need this gathering, this common picture of what we need to do. Then use the regions or the sub-regions, countries, local competence and knowledge. Inclusivity was mentioned many times here, and I do believe in that. We know that the best results, we get the best results when people are participating, when you give people a chance to participate. So building trust in multilateralism. The other is the financial
system. And if I can
Sure.
there, Stefan, I mean, that is indeed one of the key recommendations from that report that the panel, high-level panel, came up with. How do you build that trust in multilateralism and trust in, therefore, also the UN system? Because we've also heard throughout this week that there is also a sense of frustration that the UN doesn't move fast enough, doesn't act enough, doesn't build on the conclusions and the water action agenda and the conclusions that were, the decisions that were made at the UN Water Conference in March earlier this year.
Yeah, and it's easy to say UN doesn't do enough. That's easy to say. UN is 192 members.
Member states.
Member states are responsible. One issue, I think, is financing. I think I think it's only 4 countries that are adhering to the UN decision to give 0.7% of the country's GDP to hand it to ODA. 4 countries. And I remember very clearly during a meeting in the European Council when I was Prime Minister, we were discussing the budget. And several of the countries said, well, we need also to increase our international cooperation. I said, that's absolutely right, you're right. But how about if every country around this table starts giving 0.7%? Because you can't expect an organization to do everything if you don't even pay in what's needed. Another aspect of the multilateral financial system is that, I mean, the world does not lack resources. If you look at a list of the richest people in the world, you get to number 10, then you have $1 trillion. The 10 richest people. And I'm not suggesting that we rob them. But I'm saying that these are 10 people.
It's tempting, though.
And if
it's tempting.
It could be very tempting, but as a former Prime Minister, I can't say that.
Oh, drop that hat.
On the other side, I am former, so. No, my point is, that's 10 people. I mean, add all the resources in pension funds, in all that we have. Yes, we have the resources, but they are wrongly distributed. That's the problem. And we know that we need perhaps 4, 5, 6, I hear different figures, $1 trillion annually to succeed in implementing the SDG goals. Well, that's not, in itself, that's not the problem. So we have to change the mandate for the World Bank, the IMF, more of risk sharing so that you can attract more private money, because we need a lot of private money, and also change the World Bank and the IMF in their decision making, making it more equal, more fair decision making. Now we have a fact that every World Bank number one need to be an American, every IMF number one need to be a European. Why? It's not fair. And the decision making in these are not fair. So we need to bring in more inclusivity also when it comes to member states. And I think also another mindset, because the richer part of the world need to understand that lifting also poorer countries is a good thing for these countries, these people, that's solidarity, but it also brings something into the world economy, benefiting everybody. So we need to change from it's expensive to hand out money. These are investments. We're going to make investments, huge investments. But there's so many possibilities in this. We have 800 million people lacking energy. We have water scarcity, yes, but energy is the same. 800 million people lacking energy to their household. That's a huge project to start. But let's say we start the project now. So every household in the world are entitled to have energy. So it's a mentality, and as you said in the beginning, point to the solution, show the business case, if you want, for actually investing in the world. So, yeah.
No, I think you're right, Stefan, and you know, I think we are a generation that have failed, but there is still time, perhaps, to correct it. But then we need to correct it now. And I agree with you in thinking that we're probably the first generation that can really look at these challenges and say, okay, we have the solutions. We have the technological solutions, we have the financial means, if we redistribute it in the correct way. We know what works and what not. We have the experience and we have the human capital. If we pull all of these resources together now, and we collaborate and cooperate, maybe there are indeed chances to correct some of the mistakes of the past and move away from those historical legacies that we tend to be stuck in and without daring to think differently. The themes for this year's World Water Week is, of course, innovation. And when you talk about innovation, there is a tendency to think very much around those technological solutions or artificial intelligence, etc., new inventions. But there is also a very interesting dimension of innovation that is really on the how to do things.
Exactly.
And that's where I think your analysis and your report, together with Ellen Johnson-Sirleaf, also very much serves the purpose of looking at how things are done and how they can be done differently in a more innovative manner to serve the purposes of the institutions in a better way.
No, absolutely. And we describe 10 principles for a proper, a good multilateralism. And of course, one is it need to be resource. That's money. Inclusion. Focus on what we need to do. We work too much in silos. You have that competence, you work there, I have this, I work here. We need to work with solving problems for real. So you're absolutely right. Innovation is not necessarily new inventions. It could be how do you do things, processes. So that now I do hope that there is, I can see at least, I think, an increased awareness of the situation. So I hope now that this year's SDG Summit, that is held in connection to the UNGA Week, and next year's Summit of the Future, which our report was meant to be a part of a process leading up to the Summit of the Future. I hope that the member states decide that they can take bold decisions this year at the SDG Summit, next year, Summit of the Future, so that we, as an example, as we propose, we need a pact for people and planet, a pact that includes net zero emissions, phasing out of fossil fuel. In Sweden, we have had a debate for 2 years now about how can we lower the gas price. I do understand the problem for people driving cars to the work with the gas price, but that's not the alternative cost if we do not phase out fossil fuel is so much higher. So we need to see that alternative cost, and I think if we can do that more, decide where we want to go, and what does it mean for Sweden, for other countries, for other regions in the world. Yes, I think we can take on this. We need to, we must. We are right now writing the history books for the future. So the question is, what do we want future generation to read about, to learn about what we did, that we didn't understand, we were too stupid to understand, so we didn't do anything, or that we did understand and didn't do anything, or didn't do what we needed to do, or that we understood and finally we did the right thing. That's what we want them to read and learn about in the future.
And the current security situation in the world is worsening, increasing number of conflicts and tensions, and not least also in our vicinity with the war in Ukraine. How do you think that we can still make those progresses that you're talking about, and that leapfrogging into making the right things and taking the right decisions in such a worsening security climate?
Mm. Well, that's a tricky part, but I think it's perhaps even more important now to talk about future solutions, going in the right direction in these difficult days, so that it's not just gloomy. Now, when it comes to Ukraine and Russia, well, first, Russia cannot win that war, so we know that. Russia cannot win this war because that would be devastating for the international law and UN Charter and all of that. But we need to think ahead, and I personally believe very strongly that we need to change also that mindset, building more of common security. I know that if you as a neighbor, if you feel safe, I'm safer. The more insecure you feel, the more insecure I will be, because I don't know what you can attempt to
what
do.
I'm up to.
What you're up to. So and we have this, the climate issue, the environment, the health and vaccines and everything that we need to cooperate on. So we find things that we can cooperate on, knowing that we will all be better off. Right now, as I said, in Moscow, you don't have that leadership, so we need to address that. You can't be naive. You have to address that situation here and now. But we have other conflicts also that need to be resolved. So it's a change of mindset again. Why start building common security? Go from nuclear weapons is another issue that I'm very engaged in, because the mindset is now among nuclear states mutual assured destruction. And my question is that security, that we can destroy one another? I know that I can destroy you, you can destroy me, but hey, I can destroy you as well. Is that security?
Great conversation.
It's not.
No, it's not.
So in our report we write, change that mindset from mutually assured destruction to mutually assured survival. That's something else. And start that cooperation, painting the pictures of the future that we do want, and that we know everybody, poor countries, richer countries, middle-income countries will be better off if we do this. And if we invest, we will be better off, everybody.
Well, and I think that's a very important message that you're passing here, Stefan, also building on your very long experience, is that in these kinds of situations, there is basically not a winner and a loser situation. Mm-hmm. Either we're all losers, mm-hmm. or we're all winners.
Yeah.
So I think one of the key takeaways from today's discussion is that let's look at those preconditions that we can put in place and that we have the means to put in place, mm-hmm. to create such a win-win situation, yeah. including on integrating water for discussions around increased security and stability in the world.
Absolutely.
We're in agreement.
we have a deal.
We have a deal.
Okay.
That sounds great.
Okay.
Thank you so much for joining today's high-level panel. Thank you so much, Stefan, for joining us here. Thank you so much online and in the room for this very interesting discussion. And thank you not least to the panelists and to my co-moderator, Arti, as well. Thank you so much.